This is section 4.2 about labor and populism. So to go back, we have to remember the industrial era brought a lot of new types of work and quicker production, but that also meant some jobs were being replaced. It meant that some people that were in control of business made a lot of money, but a lot of the workers were left living in very poor conditions without a lot of money, because labor was often viewed just as that, as labor, not really considering the people that were working those jobs. So businesses often cut costs by paying people less or not investing in safety measures. A lot of the workers weren't really able to do much to change their situation because there really weren't a lot of regulations to help them. So some formed unions, which is like a group of people coming together to negotiate as a wide group to hope they could change their situation. So think of like strength in numbers, a group of workers coming together to try to represent their cause. At the time, though, some people still believed that unions were, quote, un-American, because they believed a free market was just a system where the supply and demand would work everything out, and that sooner or later problems would be solved without union representation. So, to outline some of the problems of the working class, on average, the worker earned $438 a year. In 1900, for most, that was not enough to support a family. So, because of that, often women and children would have to work as well to help support their families. People who worked industrial jobs usually worked 10 to 12 hours a day, at least 6 days a week. That did not include time off for sickness or for holiday, did not include any kind of health insurance or help if you were hurt at work, or aid if you had any kind of sickness. There were no workplace regulations throughout most of the 1800s. Um, and in a lot of industries, there were so many people willing to work unskilled jobs that meant competition was high among unskilled workers. So it left them with not a lot of room to voice their complaints, because if they did, their employer could easily get rid of them and replace them with somebody else. So the owner really didn't have much incentive to improve the conditions. That being said, nearly 20,000 people died. It's estimated nearly 20,000 people died from work injuries in 1 year alone in 1912. So that should tell you that work in general was not very safe for a lot of people. Besides that, many states didn't require students to attend school after the age of 14. So that meant a lot more children were working, and not as many as today were going to school. In 1910, about 2 million children worked for factories, mines, and often that included work about 12 hours a day for less than $1. Some other examples of worker situations: some companies, like Pullman Railroad Car Company, created their own town, which allowed or encouraged people to live in the town that was actually supported by the company. They didn't have to, but if you lived in that town, you would get hiring preference. So it really encouraged people to live in that town, so therefore they could get a job. The problem was the company controlled not only the workplace, but they controlled the rent, the utilities, and all of the like stores across the town. So everything pretty much was controlled by that same company, which meant that they could decide what to charge for rent and utilities every month. And on average, the rent was higher than nearby towns. So it left the worker in a situation where they felt like they needed to live in that place in order to get a job, but living in that place was also more expensive. And so they often went into debt. And in going into debt, they would have to continue to work in order to pay off that debt. So they were kind of stuck in a situation where they felt like they needed to keep working for the same company in order to repay that debt to the same company that controlled their rent and their utilities. So starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's a an increase in workers' strikes, about 37,000 worker strikes in several years. And a strike is um, a movement in which workers decide to stop working so that they can send their employers a message. If they're not working, they're usually trying to say that they want something changed, either wages or working conditions or benefits. And their decision to stop working is a way of showing you need us, so please change something or we may not work anymore. Many started unions. Again, a union is a group of people that come together to share their complaints and hopefully, by having a large number, may do something to change it. Most of the early unions were trade unions. So that meant it was a union for a specific trade, like meat packing or people that worked in the steel industry. There's a couple of examples of strikes in the later 1800s. One is the railroad strike. Railroad workers across the country wanted better wages. They wanted help when they were injured at work. And so they organized a strike, which meant they refused to work so that they would stop railroad traffic. And therefore, their employers, if the railroad traffic was stopped, they would have to listen to what the workers had to say. It was an effort to try to say, you need us as workers, so please listen to what we have to say. But instead, in this case, the federal government sent troops to force the workers back. Several people were killed. So it showed that labor unions could organize, but at this time, the federal government still was supporting the owners and not necessarily the workers. So some examples of labor organizations. One was the Knights of Labor, one of the first far-reaching labor unions. It allowed any type of worker from any occupation, which is what made it so unique. Some of their goals were an 8-hour workday, better conditions, benefits for injuries, and an end to child labor. They emphasized, instead of strikes, cooperation and compromise with employers. They wanted more profit sharing among the workers. They were later replaced by a different union called the American Federation of Labor, which the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, was a little bit different, focused on what they called day-to-day issues in each specific injury, or industry. So what that meant was workers in like the steel industry, if they wanted change, then they would first come to their employers about wages or hours or whatever their complaint was. And if they decided to go on strike in the steel industry, unions in other industries like the meatpacking industry would also go on strike against their industry. And it was a way for multiple industries to support each other and strike together, so that if there's a problem in one industry, the leaders there would be encouraged to talk to the other industry owners and say, well, your steel workers are striking for something that's going on in your industry, but it's making my meat packers go on strike. So you need to do something about it and fix it so that my industry isn't suffering as well. So a few different examples of activities involving labor unions and how they were not always perceived very well. One example is the Haymarket riot, which was in Chicago in 1886. It started as a strike of the Knights of Labor. It was a far-reaching strike in Haymarket Square, where Knights of Labor workers were protesting and going on strike simply in the name of an 8-hour workday, trying to emphasize the need for an 8-hour workday. The strike or the protest lasted several days. Police were sent in to monitor the situation. The situation got violent between police and some of the protesters. And it turned out that somebody threw a bomb into the middle of the protest where over 10 people were killed. Nobody ever proved where the bomb came from, but the Knights of Labor were blamed for it. And so that meant that with that blame, their membership went down and their perception was not, or the perception of them was not very good around the country. So their membership dropped. Another example is the Homestead strike. These were workers at Homestead Steel, which was a Carnegie plant that went on strike for better wages after their wages had been cut. Carnegie was not there at the time, but the manager, Henry Frick, once the workers went on strike, locked them out and decided to not let them come back to work if they were going to go on strike, and hired someone called scabs. Scabs were people that came in and replaced the job of the workers when they went on strike. They were hired by the employers. So these people came in to replace the job of the protesters, and as you can guess, they were not very happy about that. Henry Frick hired guards to watch over the so called scabs. It turned out that the guards and the workers on strike got into a gunfight. Several people were killed. The workers that went on strike, many of them never got their job back. Many of them were, in fact, blacklisted. It meant that other employers in the same industry were told about them and told not to hire them. And so, in fact, many of them lost their job and never were able to return to the industry at all. Another example is a Pullman strike. This was in the railroad industry, Pullman Car Company, which we talked about before. People who worked for Pullman Car Company wanted better wages because their wages had gone down at the same time that their rent and utility costs had gone up in Pullman, Illinois, the town where the Pullman workers lived. Um, the leader of the union, Eugene V. Debs, who worked with railroad workers, arranged a strike of railroad workers all across the country that if they worked on a train that carried a Pullman car, for all of them to go on strike and not allow that train to operate. And so it ended up in a mass strike across the country where railroad cars were not being run. Most of the railroads were at a standstill. And so that meant with rail traffic not flowing, then traffic across the country of goods and people and mail was really at a stopping point. And so at that point, the federal government got involved, sent troops to force the workers to go back to work and end the strike. So again, it represented the federal government supporting the employers and not the workers. So at this time, a growing number of people, especially the working class, started to support a different political and economic philosophy called socialism. Some of you have heard of socialism before. It's both an economic and political system where most of the property and resources are controlled by the government, and the profits are distributed among the people. So that means companies like railroads and electricity and goods would all be operated by the government. People would still work in those industries, but they would be paid by the government, and any profit would be shared among the workers. So it would end kind of the system of an owner earning most of the money and the laborers receiving not very much. And so for that reason, socialism was mostly supported by the working class because they saw it as a way for them to continue. If they're going to continue working hard, then they saw it as a way of them earning more of the profit and having a more fair distribution of the wealth. One of the most notable leaders of the socialist movement is Eugene Debs, and we just talked about him with the Pullman strike. He was a leader in the American Socialist Party and believed that the government should own all industry, like the railroads, for example, and utilities. That it should be operated and owned by the government. They would set the cost, and then they would also pay the workers and share any of the profit that was earned.